The last shift. The December wind cut through downtown Cleveland like a blade, carrying with it the metallic scent of snow and the distant hum of highway traffic that never seemed to sleep in this restless city. Streetlights flickered on one by one as evening settled over the urban landscape, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks of East 55th Street. In the heart of this working-class neighborhood, where corner stores and small businesses fought to survive against the relentless encroachment of chain restaurants and big-box retailers, stood Rosie's Diner, a beacon of warmth and authenticity in the growing darkness of corporate uniformity. Elena Morales pushed through the glass door of the diner, the familiar bell announcing her arrival with a cheerful chime that seemed to chase away not only the cold, but also the weight of uncertainty that had been pressing down on her shoulders for weeks. At 42, she moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent the better part of 2 decades navigating the controlled chaos of restaurant service, her movements flowing with the kind of grace that comes only from years of experience in serving others with dignity and care. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, secured with a simple elastic band that had seen better days, and despite the exhaustion that had settled into her bones over the past few months, like an unwelcome guest, she managed a genuine smile for her co-workers. The smile was more than professional courtesy. It was a reflection of the deep connections she had built with the people who had become her second family in this place that smelled of coffee, bacon grease, and the dreams of generations of working people. "Evening, Elena," called out Marcus from behind the grill, his voice carrying the easy warmth that had made him a favorite among both staff and customers during his 15 years at Rosie's. Steam rose from the sizzling burgers and hash browns, creating a comforting haze that spoke of home-cooked meals, honest work, and the kind of simple pleasures that made life bearable even during the most challenging times. Marcus Washington was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 50s, whose hands moved with the confidence of someone who had mastered his craft through thousands of shifts, hundreds of thousands of orders, and the accumulated wisdom that comes from feeding people who depend on you to make their day a little bit better. His graying beard was neatly trimmed, and his eyes held the patient kindness of someone who understood that everyone who walked through those doors was carrying their own burdens. "Hey, Marcus, how's it been today?" Elena asked, hanging her coat on the hook behind the counter and beginning the familiar ritual of transforming from Elena the worried single mother into Elena the professional server. "Steady." The usual lunch crowd, couple of truckers passing through on their way to Detroit. Mrs. Patterson came in for her regular coffee and pie, asked about you, said she missed seeing your face yesterday. That woman's got a memory like a steel trap, I tell you. Elena felt a pang of guilt that was becoming all too familiar these days. Mrs. Patterson was one of her favorite regulars, an 80-year-old widow who came in 3 times a week for apple pie and conversation, always sitting at the same corner booth where she could watch the street and remember better times. Elena had been forced to miss her shift yesterday due to another job interview, her 3rd this month, as she desperately searched for additional work to make ends meet. The job interviews had been exercises in frustration and quiet humiliation. Sitting in sterile waiting rooms, filling out applications that reduced her years of experience to checkboxes and brief descriptions, trying to explain to hiring managers half her age why a 42-year-old waitress would be a valuable addition to their teams. The retail positions paid less than what she made at Rosie's. The office jobs required computer skills she was still learning on the outdated laptop her daughter had helped her buy secondhand. "I'll make sure to catch her next time," Elena said, tying her apron around her waist. The familiar ritual of preparing for her shift usually brought her comfort, but tonight it felt different. Tonight carried the weight of finality that she hadn't yet found the courage to share with her colleagues. Rosie's diner had been struggling for months, caught in the relentless squeeze of economic forces that were transforming neighborhoods across America. The owner, Frank Kowalski, had been fighting a losing battle against rising rent, increased food costs, and competition from the new chain restaurants that had opened nearby with their corporate efficiency and standardized menus that could never capture the soul of a place like Rosie's. Elena had overheard enough hushed phone conversations and seen enough worried expressions on Frank's weathered face to know that their days were numbered. The official announcement would come tomorrow, but she already knew the devastating truth. This would be her last shift at the place that had been her second home for 8 years, the place where she had learned that dignity could be found in any honest work, and that treating people with kindness could transform even the smallest interactions into moments of grace. The evening crowd began to trickle in as darkness settled fully over the neighborhood, like a familiar blanket. There was Jimmy Rodriguez, a construction worker whose hands bore the permanent stains of his trade, and who always ordered the meatloaf special with extra gravy, leaving exactly 15% tip calculated to the penny, because that's what his father had taught him was right and proper. Sarah Chen, a nurse from the nearby hospital, grabbed her usual coffee and turkey sandwich to go, always pausing despite her exhaustion to ask about Elena's daughter, Maria, remembering details about school projects and teenage concerns with the care of someone who understood the importance of community. The Johnson family, parents with 2 young children, claimed their regular booth by the window, the kids already reaching for the crayons Elena kept specifically for them in a coffee mug decorated with faded flowers. 8-year-old Sophie and 6-year-old Marcus, named after the cook, which had delighted the older Marcus to no end, had been coming here since they were babies, and Eleanor had watched them grow from toddlers who needed high chairs to school-aged children who could read the menu themselves and always remembered to say please and thank you. Each familiar face was a reminder of what Eleanor would be losing when Rosie's closed its doors forever. This wasn't just a job for her, it was a community. A place where she'd watched children grow up, where she'd celebrated customers' victories and comforted them through their losses. It was where she'd learned that serving others was not just about bringing food to tables, but about creating moments of human connection that could sustain people through the difficulties of their daily lives. As the evening wore on, Elena found herself moving through her tasks with heightened awareness, trying to memorize every detail that she had taken for granted during thousands of previous shifts. The way the coffee maker gurgled when it reached the perfect brewing temperature, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. The sound of Marcus calling out orders from the kitchen in his distinctive bass voice that could carry over any amount of dinner conversation. The laughter of customers sharing stories over plates of comfort food, creating the kind of atmosphere that chain restaurants with their focus groups and market research could never replicate. These were the moments that had sustained her through years of financial struggle, relationship difficulties that had left her raising her 15-year-old daughter as a single mother, and the 1,000 small challenges that came with trying to build a stable life on the wages of someone who served others. The work had never made her wealthy in monetary terms, but it had given her something more valuable, a sense of purpose, a community that valued her contributions, and the daily reminder that treating people with dignity and respect could make the world a little bit better. One customer, a retired schoolteacher named Helen Morrison, sat quietly at her usual corner table, her silver hair catching the warm light of the diner's vintage fixtures. She and Elena had developed a routine over the years that had become as comforting as it was predictable. Helen would order her black coffee and blueberry pancakes, and Elena would take a moment during her rounds to listen to her stories about the changes she'd seen in Cleveland over nearly a century of life. Tonight, Helen shared a memory of raising her 3 children during the 1970s in this very neighborhood, her voice soft but proud as she described block parties and community gardens, neighbors who knew each other's names and looked out for each other's children. Her husband had worked at the Ford plant until it closed, and they had weathered the economic storms that had battered the city by relying on the networks of mutual support that places like Rosie's helped to maintain. "You know, Elena," Helen said, her eyes bright with memory and something that might have been hope, places like Rosie's aren't just about food. They're about history, about community, about people who care enough to remember your name and ask about your grandchildren. When my husband passed 5 years ago, this was where I felt like I still belonged somewhere in the world." Elena smiled warmly, feeling the truth in those words settle within her like a blessing. "You've given this place so much life, Helen. It's folks like you who make Rosie's special. Your stories, your presence, they're part of what makes this more than just a restaurant." Around 8 p.m., during a brief lull in service, Frank Kowalski emerged from his back office like a man walking to his own execution. At 68, he carried himself with the stooped shoulders of someone who had shouldered too much responsibility for too long, bearing the weight of 3 generations of family history and the dreams of dozens of employees who had depended on him for their livelihoods. His grey hair was disheveled from running his hands through it, and his eyes held the particular weariness that comes from watching a dream slowly die, despite every effort to save it. "Elena, can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked, his voice carrying the heaviness of words that had been rehearsed but never seemed adequate for the magnitude of what needed to be said. She followed him to the quiet corner booth where he conducted his informal meetings with staff, the same booth where he had hired her 8 years ago, where he had given her raises and discussed scheduling conflicts and listened to her concerns about balancing work with single motherhood. Frank's hands shook slightly as he poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot Elena had just made, a tremor that had become more pronounced over the past few weeks as the stress of the diner's situation weighed on him like a physical burden. "You know how much this place means to me," Frank began, his voice heavy with emotion that he was trying to control but couldn't quite manage. "My father opened Rosie's in 1962, named it after my mother who died when I was just 10 years old. I've been working here since I was 12 years old, sweeping floors and washing dishes after school, learning the business from the ground up, understanding that this wasn't just a restaurant but a place where people could find community and comfort." Elena nodded, having heard pieces of this history over the years, but never in such a concentrated, melancholy telling. She knew about the faded photographs behind the counter showing Frank as a young man standing beside his father, both of them wearing the same proud expression of people who understood the value of honest work and serving others. "We've weathered a lot of storms together. The recession in the 80s, when half the neighborhood was unemployed, the demographic changes in the 90s when many of our longtime customers moved to the suburbs, even the pandemic when we had to pivot to takeout only and nearly went under twice. But this time..." He paused, struggling to find words adequate to the magnitude of the loss he was about to announce. "Elena, the landlord is doubling our rent starting next month. Harrison Properties bought the building 6 months ago, and they've informed me that our rent will increase from $4,000 a month to $8,000. I've run the numbers every way I can think of, consulted with accountants and business advisors, but there's just no way to make it work without fundamentally changing what Rosie's is." Even though she had suspected this moment was coming, had seen the signs in Frank's increasing anxiety and the hushed phone conversations that always seemed to end in frustration, hearing it confirmed felt like a physical blow to her chest. The financial implications crashed over her in waves. The loss of income just as her daughter was preparing for her senior year of high school. The uncertainty of finding new employment at her age in a job market that often favored younger workers. the disruption of the stability she had worked so hard to build. "How long do we have?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. 2 weeks. I'll make the announcement to everyone tomorrow. But I wanted to tell you first. You've been more than an employee here, Elena. You've been family. You've been the heart of this place in so many ways, and I know this is going to hit you especially hard with Maria starting her senior year next year and college applications coming up. The mention of her daughter's future sent a chill through Elena that had nothing to do with the December wind rattling the windows. Maria was a straight-A student with dreams of becoming a teacher, following in the footsteps of educators like Helen Morrison, who had shaped generations of children with patience and wisdom. But college tuition seemed increasingly impossible on Elena's limited income, and the loss of her job at Rosie's would make those dreams even more distant, possibly forcing difficult conversations about community college versus university, about student loans and work-study programs, and all the compromises that financial limitations imposed on bright young minds. "Frank, I appreciate you telling me first. Is there anything we can do? Any way to fight this or negotiate with the landlord?" Frank shook his head sadly, the gesture of a man who had exhausted every possible avenue and found them all blocked by the cold mathematics of profit margins and market rates. "I've tried everything, sweetheart. Talked to 3 different banks about loans, reached out to potential investors who might want to partner with us, even considered selling to one of those chain restaurant companies, though the thought of seeing Rosie's turned into another generic franchise made me physically sick. But the numbers just don't work. The neighborhood is changing, property values are rising, and places like ours, we're becoming extinct, like dinosaurs who can't adapt to a changing climate." As Elena returned to work, her mind raced with concerns about her immediate future and that of her daughter. At 42, starting over in a new job market felt daunting in ways that went beyond simple logistics. She had skills. She was reliable, hard-working, and excellent with customers, but she also knew that many employers, particularly in the service industry, preferred younger workers who might accept lower wages and require less training in the digital systems that were becoming standard everywhere. The thought of explaining to Maria that college might not be possible, that their dreams of a better future might need to be scaled back or postponed indefinitely, made her stomach clench with an anxiety that felt like a physical weight. Maria had worked so hard, had maintained perfect grades while helping with household responsibilities and volunteering at the community center, had built the kind of record that should have opened doors to opportunities that Elena herself had never had. But even as these worries consumed her thoughts like a storm system moving through her consciousness, Elena continued to provide the same level of service that had made her beloved by Rosie's customers over the past 8 years. She refilled coffee cups with a smile that was genuine, despite her inner turmoil, remembered customers' preferences without being asked, and listened patiently to the stories and concerns that people shared over their meals. This was who she was at her core, not just a waitress, but a person who understood that sometimes the most important thing you could offer someone was genuine attention and kindness, especially in a world that often seemed to value efficiency over humanity. As the evening wound down and the last customers settled their checks with the unhurried pace of people who understood that places like Rosie's were meant to be savored rather than rushed through, Eleanor began her closing routine with particular care. She wiped down each table as if she were preserving memories, stacked chairs with the reverence of someone handling precious artifacts that contained the accumulated history of countless conversations, celebrations, and quiet moments of human connection. Tomorrow, she would have to start the difficult process of looking for new work and figuring out how to maintain her family's stability in the face of economic uncertainty. There would be applications to fill out, interviews to endure, and the humbling experience of starting over in a job market that often treated experienced workers as if their years of dedication were somehow a liability rather than an asset. But tonight, she was still Elena from Rosie's Diner, a woman who had found dignity and purpose in serving others, who had created a small but meaningful community around shared meals and genuine human connection. And as the snow began to fall outside, covering the neighborhood in a blanket of white that made even the worn buildings look beautiful and hopeful, Elena allowed herself to feel proud of the work she had done and the lives she had touched in this small corner of Cleveland. The last shift was beginning, but Elena had no idea that it would become the most important night of her working life, setting in motion a chain of events that would transform not just her own future, but the entire neighborhood's understanding of what it meant to fight for the things that truly mattered. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the gray Cleveland sky as Elena arrived at Rosie's Diner for what she knew would be one of her final shifts. Her breath forming small clouds in the bitter December air that seemed to carry with it the weight of impending change. The parking lot, usually bustling with the breakfast crowd by 7 a.m., was noticeably sparse, as if even their most loyal customers could sense that something fundamental was shifting in the atmosphere of their beloved gathering place. Inside, the atmosphere was subdued in a way that felt almost sacred, like the quiet that settles over a church before a funeral service begins. Marcus was already at the grill, his movements as precise and practiced as always, but his usual cheerful banter was replaced by a focused intensity that suggested he too suspected what was coming. The familiar sounds of sizzling bacon and crackling hash browns seemed muted, as if the kitchen itself was holding its breath. Jenny Thompson, the other full-time waitress who had been with Rosie's for 6 years, sat at the counter nursing a cup of coffee and staring out the window with an expression Eleanor recognized. The look of someone trying to prepare for bad news while hoping against hope that their worst fears wouldn't be confirmed. Jenny was a single mother like Elena, with twin boys who were juniors in high school, and she understood better than most what the loss of a steady job could mean for a family's future. Frank had called a staff meeting for 10 a.m. during the brief lull between breakfast and lunch service when the diner would be empty, except for the occasional coffee customer. As the clock approached the hour, the small team of 8 employees gathered in the dining area with the solemnity of people who knew they were about to witness the end of an era. Frank stood behind the counter, his shoulders more stooped than usual, holding a folded piece of paper that everyone instinctively knew contained their collective fate. Elena noticed the subtle signs of shared anxiety rippling through the group, the way Jenny's hands trembled slightly as she folded and refolded her apron, the way Marcus tapped his fingers nervously on the edge of a chair, and how Tony Martinez, the part-time dishwasher who was saving money for culinary school, avoided eye contact as if bracing for a physical blow. Also present were Lisa Chang, a college student who worked evenings and weekends while studying business administration. Robert "Bobby" Williams, the afternoon cook who had been with Rosie's for 12 years and whose barbecue ribs had achieved legendary status among regular customers, and Sandra Mitchell, the weekend hostess whose warm greeting had welcomed thousands of families through the front door over the past 4 years. "I want to thank you all for being here," Frank began, his voice already thick with emotion that he was struggling to control. "You've been more than employees to me. You've been family. Rosie's has been our home away from home for years, and what I have to tell you today is the hardest thing I've ever had to say in nearly 6 decades of being part of this business." His eyes scanned the room, settling on each person individually as if he were trying to memorize their faces or perhaps seeking strength from the people who had made Rosie's more than just another restaurant. Elena could see the weight of 3 generations of family history pressing down on his shoulders, the accumulated responsibility of being the keeper of his parents' dream and the steward of his employees' livelihoods. Our landlord has informed me that our rent will be doubling starting February 1st. Harrison Properties purchased our building 6 months ago, and they've given us notice that our monthly rent will increase from $4,000 to $8,000. I've spent the last month trying to find alternatives, talking to 3 different banks about loans, reaching out to potential investors who might want to partner with us, even exploring the possibility of relocating to a different space, though the thought of leaving this location where we've built so many memories seemed almost like a betrayal of everything we've stood for. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of traffic on East 55th Street and the soft whistle of wind through the gaps around the old windows. Eleanor felt the weight of shared grief settling over the room like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about losing jobs, though that was devastating enough for people who had built their lives around the stability of steady employment. This was about losing a piece of their identities, a place that had shaped who they were and how they understood their place in the world. After 58 years in business, Rosie's Diner will be closing permanently on December 31st, Frank continued, his voice breaking slightly on the words that seemed to hang in the air like a death sentence. Jenny was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper, carrying the fear that all of them were feeling, but few had the courage to voice. What about severance pay? What about references? I've got 2 boys who are looking at colleges next year, and I don't know how I'm going to manage without steady income. Frank's expression grew even more pained, the look of a man who wished he could promise more than his circumstances would allow. I'll do everything I can to help each of you find new positions. I'll write the strongest recommendations you've ever seen, and I'll make myself available to any potential employers who want to verify your work history and character. As for severance, I wish I could do more, but with the financial situation we're in, I can only guarantee your final paychecks and any vacation time you have accrued. Eleanor's heart sank as the full implications of their situation became clear. She had been hoping for at least a few weeks of severance pay to help bridge the gap while she looked for new work, time to find something that could provide the stability her family needed. The reality of her situation was becoming clearer and more frightening by the minute. She would need to find new employment immediately, with no cushion to allow for a careful job search or training in new skills. Marcus stepped forward, his voice steady despite the obvious emotion he was struggling to contain. Frank, we all know you've done everything you could. This isn't your fault. It's the fault of people who see buildings and neighborhoods as nothing more than opportunities to maximize profit. But what about our customers, Mrs. Patterson, the Rodriguez family, the Johnsons, all the people who've been coming here for years or even decades? They're going to be heartbroken. This place means as much to them as it does to us. I'll be posting a notice today, Frank replied, his voice heavy with the weight of disappointing not just his employees, but the entire community that had made Rosie's their gathering place. I want them to hear it from us, not from some rumor or newspaper article. They deserve better than that, and they deserve time to say their goodbyes. As the meeting dispersed, Eleanor found herself walking mechanically through her shift, each familiar task now carrying the weight of impending loss. The lunch crowd seemed smaller than usual, as if word was already beginning to spread through the neighborhood networks that carried news both good and bad with the efficiency of small-town communication systems. She watched Mrs. Patterson slowly work her way through her apple pie and black coffee, unaware that her daily routine was about to be shattered by forces completely beyond her control. The elderly woman had been coming to Rosie's for over 20 years, ever since her husband's death had left her alone in a world that often seemed designed for couples and families. Elena knew that Mrs. Patterson lived on a fixed Social Security income in a small apartment 3 blocks away, and that her visits to Rosie's weren't just about food. They were about human connection, about having a place where people knew her name and cared about her well-being. Around 2 p.m., Elena made a decision that would change everything, though she had no way of knowing it at the time. She pulled out her phone, a device she'd only recently learned to use with confidence, and began typing a post on the neighborhood's Facebook group, a community page where residents shared everything from lost pet alerts to recommendations for local services to celebrations of small victories and memorials for neighbors who had passed away. The Facebook group had become an essential communication tool for the neighborhood, with over 800 members who used it to organize block parties, report suspicious activity, share resources during difficult times, and maintain the kinds of connections that had once been maintained through front porch conversations and chance encounters at the grocery store. Friends and neighbors, I'm writing this with a heavy heart that feels like it's breaking into 1,000 pieces. Rosie's Diner, where I've had the privilege of serving this community for 8 years, will be closing permanently on December 31st due to a massive rent increase that has made it impossible for Frank to continue operating the business that has been his family's legacy for nearly 6 decades. Elena paused, choosing her words carefully as she tried to capture not just the facts of what was happening, but the deeper meaning of what would be lost. This isn't just about losing jobs, though that's devastating for all of us who work there and depend on this income to support our families. It's about losing a place where neighbors became family, where kids celebrated birthdays with cake and ice cream while their parents shared coffee and conversation, where people found comfort during difficult times and shared joy during celebrations, and where the simple act of sharing a meal created lasting connections that transcended differences in age, race, background, and circumstances. She continued typing, her words flowing from a place of deep emotion, but also from her understanding of what Rosie's meant to the broader community. Rosie's has been a cornerstone of our neighborhood for nearly 60 years, surviving economic downturns, demographic changes, and all the challenges that have transformed Cleveland over the decades. It's where business deals were made over handshakes and coffee, where job hunters found networking opportunities, where families marked important milestones, where lonely people found companionship, and where anyone could get a good meal and friendly service regardless of their economic circumstances. I can't help but wonder, if we lose places like this, what happens to our sense of community? What happens to the small businesses that make our neighborhood unique and give it character? What happens to the gathering places where people from different walks of life can come together and remember that we're all part of something larger than ourselves? I don't have answers to these questions, but I felt like you deserved to hear this news from someone who loves this place as much as you do. Someone who has been honored to serve you and be part of your lives in small but meaningful ways. Thank you for 8 wonderful years of letting me be part of your stories, your celebrations, your sorrows, and your daily routines. You've given me more than I could ever give back. Elena hesitated for only a moment before hitting post, her finger hovering over the button as she considered whether she was doing the right thing. She had no experience with social media activism or community organizing, no training in how to mobilize public opinion or create pressure for social change. She was simply a waitress who wanted to honor the place that had given her purpose and the people who had made her work meaningful. She had no idea that her heartfelt message would be shared hundreds of times within hours, sparking a community response that would surprise everyone involved and ultimately change not just her own future, but the entire neighborhood's understanding of its own power to shape the forces that affected their daily lives. The first comments appeared within minutes, each one representing a person whose life had been touched by Rosie's in ways both large and small. Elena, this is heartbreaking. Rosie's has been part of my family's life for over 20 years. My kids took their first steps in that back booth, and my husband proposed to me at table 6. Isn't there something we can do to save it? My grandmother took me to Rosie's for my birthday every year until she passed away 5 years ago. This place holds so many memories that I can't imagine losing it. There has to be some way to fight this. The gentrification of our neighborhood is killing everything that made it special. First we lost Martinez Books, then the community center, now Rosie's. What's next? Are we just going to let corporate interests destroy everything that gives our community its soul? Elena, you and the staff at Rosie's have been like family to so many of us. No matter what happens with the diner, we won't forget the kindness you've shown us over the years. Oh. As the afternoon progressed, Elena noticed that the diner was getting busier than usual, with customers she hadn't seen in months stopping by, many of them mentioning her Facebook post and expressing their shock and sadness at the news. The mood was bittersweet. People wanting to show their support while processing their own grief about the impending closure of a place that had been central to their sense of community belonging. Just before the dinner rush began, a woman Elena didn't recognize walked into the diner. She was in her mid-30s, professionally dressed in a way that suggested she worked in an office environment rather than a service job, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting things done and asking the kinds of questions that led to meaningful answers. She approached Elena directly, bypassing the hostess station and the usual protocol for seating. "Excuse me, are you Elena Morales, the one who wrote the Facebook post about the diner closing?" "Yes, that's me. Can I help you with something?" The woman extended her hand with the firm grip of someone who understood the importance of making strong first impressions. "I'm Jennifer Walsh, and I'm a journalist with the Cleveland Plain Dealer. I'd like to talk to you about what's happening here, if you have a few minutes. I think this story needs to be told to a much wider audience." Elena glanced around the diner, which had filled up with the early dinner crowd of families, workers getting off their shifts, and regulars who treated Rosie's as their neighborhood living room. "I'm working right now, but I can talk during my break in about an hour. Would that work for you?" "Perfect. I'll have a coffee and wait. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to talk to some of your customers as well. Get their perspectives on what this place means to the community." As Elena continued her shift, she noticed that Jennifer was doing more than just waiting. She was observing with the trained eye of someone who understood how to read the subtle dynamics of human interaction, taking notes in a small reporter's notebook, and engaging in quiet conversations with customers who seemed eager to share their own stories about what Rosie's had meant to their lives and their families. Elena began to realize that her Facebook post had set something in motion that was bigger than she had anticipated, something that might have implications far beyond the simple goal of letting her friends and neighbors know about the diner's closure. For the first time since Frank had delivered the devastating news, she felt a flutter of something that might have been hope, though she couldn't yet imagine what form that hope might take or where it might lead. The Cleveland Plain Dealer article appeared online at 6 a.m. the next morning, and by the time Elena arrived at Rosie's for her shift, her phone was buzzing with notifications like an electronic symphony of support and outrage. The headline read, "When Neighborhood Heart Stops Beating, the Story Behind Rosie's Diner's Closure," and Jennifer Walsh had crafted a piece that went far beyond the simple facts of a restaurant closing to explore the deeper questions about community, belonging, and the human cost of economic development. The article wove together Elena's personal story, a single mother working to support her college-bound daughter while serving a community that had become her extended family, with the broader narrative of gentrification affecting working-class neighborhoods across Cleveland and throughout urban America. Jennifer had interviewed longtime customers who spoke eloquently about how Rosie's had served as an informal community center where people celebrated milestones, found comfort during difficult times, and built the relationships that made a neighborhood more than just a collection of buildings and businesses. Mrs. Patterson had been quoted extensively, her words carrying the weight of 8 decades of life experience. "Places like Rosie's are where community happens." They're where you learn that you matter to someone, even if you're just an old lady living alone. When we lose these gathering places, we lose something essential about what it means to be human beings living together. But it was the article's final paragraph that would prove most influential in sparking the community response that was about to unfold. As communities across America struggle with the balance between economic development and preserving local character, the impending closure of Rosie's Diner raises a crucial question. What do we lose when we prioritize profit margins over the places that bring people together? And perhaps more importantly, what are we willing to do to protect the spaces where community actually happens? Elena's Facebook post, which had been shared locally the day before, was now being shared across Cleveland and beyond as people discovered the Plain Dealer article through social media algorithms that seemed to understand that this story touched something deeper than local news. By noon, the post had over 2,000 shares and hundreds of comments from people across the city expressing their support and sharing similar stories of beloved local businesses that had been lost to rising rents and corporate development. The comment section had become a repository of collective memory and shared frustration. This is exactly what happened to my neighborhood coffee shop in Lakewood. The landlord tripled the rent, and now it's a chain sandwich place that has no connection to the community. My grandfather's barbershop was forced out last year after 40 years in business. These developers don't understand that they're not just displacing businesses, they're destroying the social fabric that holds neighborhoods together. Is there a legal fund we can contribute to? Can we organize some kind of protest or petition? There has to be something we can do to fight back against these corporate vultures. The immediate impact was visible in the diner itself, which was experiencing the largest crowds Elena had seen in months. The lunch crowd included not just regular customers, but many people she didn't recognize, all of them explaining that they had come after reading the article or seeing the Facebook post. But more significant than the increased business were the conversations happening at every table. People weren't just here for a meal, they were here to be part of something larger than themselves. Around 1 p.m., Elena noticed a woman at table 6 who had been there for over an hour, not just eating, but conducting what appeared to be an informal meeting with a rotating series of people who approached her booth with the purposeful energy of individuals who were ready to take action. When the woman approached Elena during a brief lull in service, she introduced herself with the confidence of someone who had successfully fought these battles before. Elena, I'm Maria Santos, and I'm a community organizer with the Cleveland Neighborhood Alliance. I've been following the response to your post and the newspaper article, and I think we might be able to help, but I need to understand the specifics of the situation. Would Frank be willing to meet with me? I've seen situations like this before, and sometimes there are options that business owners don't know exist. Elena found Frank in his office, hunched over a pile of paperwork that seemed to grow larger every day as he tried to manage the complex process of closing a business that had been in operation for nearly 6 decades. When she explained who Maria was and why she wanted to meet, his expression showed equal parts hope and wariness, the look of someone who had been disappointed too many times to allow himself to believe that salvation might still be possible. I appreciate people wanting to help, Frank said wearily, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had spent weeks exploring every possible avenue and finding them all blocked by the cold mathematics of profit margins and market rates. But I've already explored every option I can think of. The landlord wants to double our rent from $4,000 a month to $8,000, and there's no way our revenue can support that kind of increase. We'd have to raise our prices so much that we'd lose the very customers who make this place special. Maria leaned forward with the focused intensity of someone who had successfully fought these battles before, her eyes bright with the kind of strategic thinking that came from years of experience in community organizing. Frank, I've worked on similar situations in neighborhoods across the city, and I've learned that sometimes the solution isn't just about finding more money. Sometimes it's about changing the dynamics of the negotiation entirely. Tell me about your landlord. What do you know about Harrison Properties? Harrison Properties. They own about 6 buildings in this area, all purchased in the last 2 years as part of some kind of investment portfolio. Corporate office downtown in one of those glass towers, run by people who've never actually seen the neighborhood or talked to any of the business owners personally. They communicate entirely through lawyers and property managers. Exactly what I suspected, Maria said, making notes in a leather-bound notebook that looked like it had seen extensive use in previous campaigns. These investment companies often make decisions based purely on spreadsheets and market analyses, without understanding the community impact or the potential for negative publicity. Have you tried negotiating with them at all, or have all your communications been one way? Frank's laugh was bitter, carrying the frustration of someone who had felt powerless in the face of corporate indifference. Negotiating? They sent a form letter with the new lease terms. Take it or leave it, they said. No discussion, no consideration of our history as reliable tenants, no acknowledgement that we've been paying rent on time for 8 years and maintaining the property better than they probably deserved. That's about to change, Maria said confidently, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen ordinary people achieve extraordinary things when they work together strategically. Elena, your story has struck a nerve because it represents something much larger than one diner closing. People are frustrated with watching their neighborhoods change in ways that benefit developers and investors while displacing the businesses and people that create community character. We can use that energy. Over the next hour, Maria outlined a strategy that combined community organizing, media pressure, and economic leverage in ways that Eleanor had never imagined possible. She explained how similar campaigns in other cities had successfully pressured landlords to reconsider rent increases when faced with negative publicity, community opposition to their other projects, and the prospect of long-term vacancies that could be more costly than reasonable rent agreements. The key, Maria explained, her hands moving expressively as she spoke, is showing Harrison Properties that keeping Rosie's open at a reasonable rent is actually in their financial interest. Empty storefronts don't generate revenue, and controversy around their business practices can affect their ability to attract tenants to their other properties. It can also create problems with city council members when they need permits and zoning approvals for future developments. Eleanor found herself cautiously optimistic for the first time in weeks, though she was careful not to let hope override the practical realities they were facing. What would we need to do? I don't have any experience with community organizing or political pressure campaigns. That's okay. I do. And I can teach you what you need to know. First, we need to document the community support more formally. I'm thinking a petition, but also collecting stories from customers about what this place means to them and their families. Second, we need to research Harrison Properties, understand their other investments, their public image concerns, who makes their decisions. Third, we need to organize a visible demonstration of community support that gets media attention and shows them that this isn't just about one business owner complaining about rent. Frank looked skeptical, his expression reflecting the weariness of someone who had been fighting an uphill battle for months. You really think a petition and some publicity will make them change their minds about thousands of dollars in potential rent increases? These people deal in millions of dollars. Why would they care about a neighborhood diner? Frank, I've seen community pressure work in situations where people thought it was impossible. 2 years ago, we helped save Martinez Grocery on the west side when their landlord tried to triple their rent to force them out for a chain pharmacy. Last year, We prevented the eviction of 5 families in the Tremont area when their building was sold to a company that wanted to convert it to luxury condos. It's not about the petition itself. It's about creating a situation where backing down becomes the path of least resistance for the landlord. As Maria left to begin organizing the campaign, Elena returned to work with renewed energy, though she was careful to manage her expectations. The afternoon crowd included not just regular customers, but also people who had clearly come specifically to show their support after reading about the situation. Mrs. Patterson, who rarely stayed past her usual coffee and pie, had invited 3 friends from her senior center to join her for an extended visit that turned into an impromptu strategy session about how seniors could contribute to the campaign. The Johnson family had brought grandparents and cousins for what they announced was their solidarity dinner, transforming their usual quiet family meal into a multi-generational gathering that filled 2 tables and generated the kind of warm, chaotic energy that had always made Rosie's feel more like a community center than a restaurant. Eleanor's daughter Maria arrived after school, as she often did, to do homework in the back booth before the evening rush began. At 15, Maria had grown up partially at Rosie's, doing school projects at the corner table, helping with simple tasks during busy periods, and absorbing the lessons about community, service, and human dignity that her mother had learned through years of treating every customer with respect and care. Maria understood better than most what the diner's closure would mean for their family's stability, but she also understood the deeper implications of what was happening. She had been following the social media response to her mother's Facebook post, had read the newspaper article, and had heard the conversations among her classmates about gentrification and community displacement. "Mom, I saw the article online, and kids at school were talking about it during lunch. Some of them shared your Facebook post, and now people who don't even live in our neighborhood are saying they want to help. Are we really going to be okay?" Eleanor sat down beside her daughter during a brief lull in service, choosing her words carefully as she tried to balance honesty about their situation with hope about the possibilities that were beginning to emerge. "We're going to figure this out, Mija. I can't promise it will be easy, and I can't guarantee that we'll be able to save Rosie's, but we're going to be okay. And maybe, just maybe, we might not have to figure it out alone." She explained about Maria Santos and the community organizing effort that was beginning to take shape, about the possibility that their situation might be changeable if enough people worked together strategically. As she talked, Elena realized that her daughter was witnessing something important, how people could come together to fight for things that mattered, how individual struggles could become community causes, and how sometimes the most powerful response to feeling helpless was to take action alongside others who shared your values. "What can I do to help?" Maria asked, her question reflecting the kind of civic engagement that Eleanor had always tried to model, but had never seen her daughter embrace so directly. "You can help me collect stories from customers about what this place means to them. You can help spread the word on social media in ways that I'm still learning, and you can remind me that this fight is about more than just our family. It's about the kind of community we want to live in." Ndari. By 6 p.m., the dinner crowd had transformed Rosie's into something Eleanor had never experienced. Part restaurant, part community meeting, part celebration of collective determination. At one table, customers were signing a petition that someone had created and printed at work. At another, a regular customer was collecting email addresses for a mailing list. The couple by the window was designing a flyer on their laptop, while the elderly man at the counter was calling friends to tell them about the campaign and asking them to spread the word. Elena moved through the controlled chaos with a sense of wonder that bordered on disbelief. For years, she had served these people, had been part of their daily routines and special celebrations, had provided the kind of consistent, caring service that had made their visits to Rosie's feel like coming home. Now they were serving her, working to preserve not just her job, but the place that had become central to their own sense of community belonging. The energy in the room was electric, charged with the kind of collective purpose that Elena had read about in history books but had never experienced firsthand. People who had been strangers an hour earlier were now exchanging phone numbers and making plans to meet again. Conversations that had started at individual tables were connecting across the room as people discovered shared concerns and common goals. As the evening wound down, Frank approached Eleanor with an expression she hadn't seen in weeks. Tentative hope mixed with disbelief, as if he couldn't quite trust what he was witnessing. "Elena, I've never seen anything like what happened here today. Maria Santos called me an hour ago with some preliminary research on Harrison Properties. Did you know they've got a big commercial development project pending city council approval next month? She thinks that might give us some leverage." Eleanor felt her heart beat faster as the implications of this information began to sink in. "What kind of leverage?" "Well, if they're trying to get permits and zoning approvals for new projects, negative publicity about forcing out beloved local businesses might not be great timing for them. And apparently, they're already facing some community opposition to their development plan, from residents who are concerned about traffic, parking, and the impact on neighborhood character." For the first time since learning about the rent increase, Elena allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they might find a way to save Rosie's. More importantly, she was beginning to understand that regardless of the outcome, something precious was happening in her community. People were remembering how to fight for the things they valued, how to work together toward common goals, and how to transform individual struggles into collective action that could create real change. The community was rising, and Elena was no longer facing an uncertain future alone. She was part of something larger now, something that would continue to matter whether they saved the diner or not. The bonds being forged in this moment of crisis would outlast any single business or building, creating a network of people committed to protecting and nurturing the elements that made their neighborhood worth fighting for. 3 days after Maria Santos's first visit to Rosie's, the campaign to save the diner had evolved into something neither Elena nor Frank could have imagined when this crisis first began. What had started as a single Facebook post written from the heart of a worried waitress had grown into a coordinated community effort involving dozens of volunteers, 3 neighborhood organizations, local politicians, and media attention that extended far beyond Cleveland to include national outlets that covered stories about community organizing and economic justice. Elena arrived at work to find Maria Santos already seated at the corner booth, which had become the unofficial campaign headquarters, its red vinyl seats and formica table now serving as the nerve center for an operation that was growing more sophisticated by the day. Spread across the table were petition sheets with hundreds of signatures, printed emails of support from across the city and beyond, phone lists of local media contacts, and a thick folder of what Maria called impact stories, detailed accounts from customers about what Rosie's meant to their families and the broader community. "Elena, you need to see this," Maria said, looking up from her laptop with the excitement of someone who had just discovered a crucial piece of information. "The online petition now has over 3,000 signatures, and the stories people are sharing are incredible. But more importantly, I think we've found our leverage point with Harrison Properties." She turned the laptop screen toward Elena, showing a web page for a proposed apartment complex development that looked like the kind of modern, upscale housing that was transforming neighborhoods across the city. "Harrison is trying to get city council approval for a 90-unit luxury apartment building on Euclid Avenue, about 6 blocks from here. The project needs a zoning variance because it exceeds the current height restrictions, and there's already been significant community opposition because it would require demolishing two historic buildings that have been part of the neighborhood's character for over a century. You see, Eleanor studied the development plans with their sleek architectural renderings and promises of luxury living in the heart of a vibrant urban community, beginning to understand the connection between this project and their situation at Rosie's. And if they're getting negative publicity about forcing out local businesses. Exactly. City council members pay attention to community sentiment, especially on controversial projects that are already generating opposition. Harrison's attorney actually called me yesterday. Apparently they're getting calls and emails from people connecting their treatment of Rosie's to concerns about their overall impact on the neighborhood. They're starting to realize that their business practices in one area can affect their ability to get approvals for projects in other areas. Frank emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, his movements more energetic than Elena had seen in months. Over the past few days, the combination of increased business and renewed hope had transformed him physically and emotionally. The stooped shoulders had straightened, and there was energy in his movement that suggested he was beginning to believe that this fight might actually be winnable. Maria, any word from Harrison's office about a meeting? I have to admit, after decades of running this place, I never thought I'd be involved in something like a political campaign. That's the other piece of good news. They've agreed to meet with us next Tuesday, not just a phone call or an exchange of letters, an actual meeting with their property manager and a company representative. They wouldn't agree to that unless they were feeling some real pressure from multiple directions. Elena felt a surge of anticipation mixed with nervousness as the reality of the upcoming meeting began to sink in. What happens at the meeting? What do we ask for? And how do we make our case? Maria pulled out a notepad filled with her careful preparation notes. The kind of detailed planning that Elena was learning was essential to successful community organizing. We go in with a specific, reasonable proposal based on solid research. I've been looking into comparable properties in the area, and I think we can make a case for keeping the rent at its current level for the next 2 years, with modest increases after that tied to actual cost of living adjustments rather than market speculation. But why would they agree to that when they could potentially get much more money from a different tenant? What's our leverage beyond bad publicity? Because we're going to show them that the potential costs of forcing you out outweigh the potential benefits. Empty storefronts don't generate revenue, and it can take months to find new tenants who are reliable and established. Controversy around their business practices can affect their ability to attract quality tenants to their other properties. And most importantly, community opposition can create serious problems with city council members when they need permits, zoning approvals, and other official support for their development projects. As the morning progressed, Elena watched the campaign's impact play out in real time throughout the diner. The breakfast crowd included several people she recognized from television. City Councilwoman Janet Thompson, who ordered coffee and spent 20 minutes talking to customers about the broader issues of neighborhood development. A local TV reporter who conducted informal interviews while eating pancakes, and a representative from the mayor's office who left a business card with Frank and promised that the city was paying attention to the situation. But the most powerful moments came from regular customers sharing their personal connections to Rosie's, stories that were both heartbreaking and inspiring in their demonstration of how a simple neighborhood restaurant could become central to people's lives. Mrs. Patterson had brought a photo album showing 4 generations of her family celebrating birthdays and anniversaries at the diner, each picture telling a story of continuity and belonging that transcended individual relationships. The Rodriguez family presented Frank with a handwritten letter from their 8-year-old daughter, thanking him for always remembering that she liked extra whipped cream on her hot chocolate and for making her feel special every time she came in. The letter was written in careful cursive handwriting and decorated with drawings of the diner, with stick figures representing Eleanor and Frank and Marcus, all of them smiling. Elena found herself becoming the unofficial keeper of these stories, and as she collected them throughout the day, she began to understand something profound about the community she had served for 8 years. Rosie's wasn't just a restaurant, it was a repository of shared memory, a place where individual life stories had intertwined to create something larger than the sum of their parts. Each story revealed a different aspect of what the diner meant to people. The businessman who had negotiated his first major contract over coffee and pie at table 12. The young couple who had their first date at Rosie's and now brought their children here for special occasions. The group of retirees who met every Thursday morning to solve the world's problems over endless refills of coffee. The night shift workers who found comfort in a warm meal and friendly conversation during the lonely hours when most of the city was asleep. Around noon, Jennifer Walsh from the Plain Dealer returned with a photographer, ready to document the community organizing effort for a follow-up article. Elena, the response to the initial article has been phenomenal. My editor wants to do a follow-up piece about the community organizing effort and what it says about grassroots democracy in action. Would you be willing to be interviewed again? Eleanor agreed. But as she talked to Jennifer, she realized that her perspective on the situation had fundamentally changed over the past few days. When this crisis first began, she had been focused primarily on her own family's financial security, worried about losing her job and her ability to support her daughter's education. Now she understood that the fight to save Rosie's was about something much larger. It was about communities asserting their right to determine their own character, about pushing back against the assumption that economic development required sacrificing the places and relationships that gave neighborhoods their identity. What's most surprised you about the community response? Jennifer asked, her recorder capturing not just Eleanor's words, but the background sounds of a busy restaurant where people were actively engaged in democratic participation. I think what surprised me most is discovering how much people were already feeling about these issues. My Facebook post didn't create these feelings, it just gave people a way to express something they were already thinking about. Everyone has a story about a place they loved that disappeared, or a community gathering spot that got replaced by something more profitable but less meaningful. People are hungry for ways to fight back against these changes, but they often don't know where to start. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, David Kim, a real estate attorney who had read about the situation and offered to provide legal consultation pro bono. As Maria explained the campaign's strategy, David reviewed the lease documents and provided crucial insight into the negotiation process that Elena found both educational and empowering. The key thing to understand, David explained to Elena and Frank, is that this isn't just about emotion or community pressure, though those things certainly matter. You're actually in a stronger legal and financial position than you might realize. Your lease has been consistently paid on time for 8 years. You've maintained the property well, and you've got demonstrated community support that increases the property's value as a commercial location. He pointed to specific clauses in the lease agreement, explaining concepts that Elena had never encountered before, but was quickly learning to understand. Harrison has the legal right to raise your rent, but they also have a business interest in maintaining stable, long-term tenants. The costs associated with tenant turnover, lost rent during vacancy periods, advertising costs, legal fees for new leases, the risk of getting tenants who don't pay consistently, those costs add up quickly. Elena began to feel more confident about the upcoming meeting as she realized they weren't just asking for charity or sympathy, They were presenting a business case based on real financial considerations that made sense from the landlord's perspective as well as their own. As the day continued, Elena noticed that the energy in the diner had shifted in ways that went beyond the simple increase in customer traffic. People weren't just coming to show support for a struggling business. They were coming to be part of a community that was actively fighting for its values. Conversations at different tables were connecting as strangers introduced themselves and shared their own stories of neighborhood change and community activism. The elderly man at table 4 turned out to be a retired union organizer who offered advice about media strategy. The young couple at table 8 were urban planning graduate students who provided research about zoning laws and development patterns. The woman dining alone at the counter was a small business owner who had successfully fought her own landlord's rent increase and was eager to share what she had learned. By closing time, Elena had collected over 50 written stories from customers, each one documenting a specific way that Rosie's had played a meaningful role in someone's life. Reading through them as she prepared to lock up for the night, she was struck by recurring themes that revealed the depth of the diner's impact on the community. Rosie's, as a place where people found acceptance during difficult times, where children learned about community responsibility and civic engagement, where neighbors from different backgrounds discovered shared values, and where the simple act of sharing food had created lasting friendships that transcended economic and social boundaries. One story particularly moved her, from a customer she barely recognized, an elderly man who came in occasionally for coffee and had never spoken much beyond placing his order. "When my wife died 3 years ago, I didn't know how to be around people anymore. Grief makes you feel invisible, like you're watching life happen from behind glass. But Eleanor at Rosie's always remembered my name, always